I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So food prices and productivity and the economy are all big issues for us. And I read a fascinating article in the Globe and Mail by Christina Caron. She's an economist and author whose current work focuses on the impact of climate change and environmental deterioration on the economy. Her career has included positions as a federal public servant, she's an executive, a think tank economist, a diplomat, and a policy aid advisor to two different prime ministers and a federal cabinet minister. Her graduate and undergraduate studies in economics were conducted at McGill University. And the article that I saw, that you probably saw as well, was food inflation is going up and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Christina Caron, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Brian.
So this was a really great column. What do you think about it?
Well, I wrote that really to draw attention to some of the pressures that are currently existing on our food system. And people tend to think about food price inflation as being driven largely by short-term measures. But the reality is that food prices are going up around in most countries around the globe. And in Canada, it is certainly true that food price inflation has been going up faster than other prices, but this is a worldwide phenomenon. And in fact,
So you mean it's not just inflation?
It's being driven by a bunch of different developments, but they're largely global developments. They're not restricted.
So we had one political leader who said it was all because of Justin Trudeau and called it just inflation. That's not true?
Well, what you see when you look at global food prices is that they trended down for many, many decades. And then around 25 years ago, they reversed course and they've been rising ever since. So global food prices have been rising for 25 years. So this is not just a Canadian phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon.
I thought we had, increased productivity in agriculture and in raising chickens and raising beef and a whole bunch of things. Why are prices going up if we've had this productivity increases, efficiency increases in everything that everything we grow, everything we produce?
So again, productivity was certainly rising in the agricultural sector for many years, and it was quite high. But again, agricultural productivity has started to decline in the last 15 years, and it's actually come down quite a bit. And when you look at the drivers, the people who studied this phenomenon attribute it largely to climate change, to the impact of droughts, hurricanes, floods, hail. And again, this is not just happening in Canada.
And no one can do anything about it? Is that the title that you're comfortable with in your article?
That was not my title. That was the title of the Globe editors. And actually, I would disagree with that. And in fact, I refer at the bottom of that article to some of the policy measures that we could take to address this, which are largely climate measures to address climate change and biodiversity loss.
So climate change is sort of out of favor of late. In the United States, you've got climate change deniers that are in office. In Canada, we had a consumer carbon tax that has been done away with. The Green Party is down near the low end of any of their recent polling. What's going on?
Well, first of all, in Canada, you actually see that there's very strong. The latest polling results that I saw from Abacus showed that there's actually very strong support in Canada for action to fight climate change. So I think certainly south of the border, you're absolutely right. But globally, the European Union is taking this issue very seriously, is putting through a lot of measures. And certainly the carbon tax was not a popular measure. I personally think it was not terribly well communicated. I think it was actually would have been a very effective measure. But there is certainly support among Canadians for action to combat climate change.
So what was the point of your article? What were you trying to convey?
The key point of my article was that food prices are rising in Canada, not just because of temporary or local factors. You know, people tend to point to things like COVID or the invasion of Ukraine, or more recently the tariff wars. But these are ongoing pressures. They're largely environmental and they are global. And we're seeing our agricultural sector getting hit by drought, by storms. We've seen huge price increases in a number of imported goods from around the world where there have been droughts or major storms, hurricanes. So we've seen huge price spikes, for example, in Spanish olives, in Brazilian oranges, and Vietnamese coffee, California vegetables over the last few years. And then domestically, we've also seen major price increases in areas that have been hit by drought or by storms. So, for example, in Nova Scotia, the blueberry sector was hit very hard by drought this year, and blueberry prices spiked. In Alberta, which has experienced 4 years of drought now, ranchers have been forced to cut their herd size, which has pushed up beef prices. A few years ago, we had flooding around the Abbotsford area, and a lot of chickens were killed as a result. And at that point, chicken and egg prices spiked. There are other environmental factors as well that are driving price increases. We've seen crashing fish populations around Canada.
In your article, you say that fish catches have plummeted by over 60%. Really?
Just in the last 20 years, and that is following huge decreases rather prior to that. That's why the cod fishery was closed in 1992. Is basically the cod fishery was fished to the point that there were effectively no more cod left to catch. And so we've had the cod fishery was closed for the better part of 30 years and it opened just in a very minor way very recently.
You talk about pollinator losses, and you say that bees and butterflies and birds have been falling because of climate change. My God, really? We're worried about bees and butterflies?
Huge declines in pollinators, and most farmers rely heavily on wild pollinators. I mean, there are managed pollinators as well that many farmers are actually increasingly turning to because of the decline in wild pollinators. But wild pollinators, as you say, bees, butterflies, and birds and bats as well are declining everywhere.
Because of climate change, or because we just don't like them?
It's because of climate change. It's because of pesticide use. It's because of habitat loss. Those are some of the key drivers. And certainly pesticide use is recognized as a major driver of pollinator loss. And the European Union has actually moved forward to ban a number of pesticides that are still legal in Canada and the US that are known to harm pollinators and to drive those population losses.
And you talked about vanilla. Why does vanilla need a special kind of pollinator?
So there's only one bee in the world that is known to be capable of pollinating a vanilla orchid, and that is the Melipona bee. And that's a native of Mexico, and it has declined to virtual extinction now. So as a result, any vanilla that you buy is hand pollinated, which, as you can imagine, is a very labor intensive and expensive process. So vanilla is now one of the most expensive food ingredients in the world. It's largely because of the fact that it has to be hand pollinated, as well as the fact that there were huge storms that hit Madagascar, which is a major source of vanilla in the last few years, that wiped out many of the vanilla plantations.
Soil degradation and erosion, you say, reduce yields by up to 50% in some regions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a finding from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and actually. That is in some areas, and the way our agriculture functions, it's tended to really accelerate soil loss to 100 to 1,000 times above background levels. And actually, the Food and and Agriculture Organization has found that since the mid-century, last century, there's been basically soil erosion has eroded our capacity to produce food by about 25%.
So let me ask you the question then. So, the common perception based on the politics in Canada was that the consumer carbon tax was adding to inflation. And so therefore it was taken away because of popular opinion, against it. What you're saying is that, please correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is that you think actually climate change has had far more of a negative impact on food inflation, and we've got to do something to increase food production by way of combating climate change. And so therefore, really, the consumer carbon tax was a good idea because it combated climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. That's my personal view, and not just my personal view. It's actually the view of most economists. Matter of fact, there were 200 economists that wrote a letter last spring arguing exactly that. Certainly, it's been studied very carefully, and a carbon tax is actually thought to be the most effective and efficient way to address climate change. Because if you take away a carbon tax, which by the way was largely recycled, so it was not a net drain on the economy, it was almost entirely recycled. But if you take away that particular vehicle, then you're left with regulation, which is generally a less efficient and more expensive way of addressing climate change.
This is fascinating. So, this common perception that we had that consumer carbon taxes were bad and were causing inflation, you're actually saying it's the opposite, that it is climate change, drought, lack of pollinators, and a whole bunch of other issues associated with climate change that are causing food price inflation. Fascinating. We often get the wrong story because we try to simplify things, and we don't go back to sort of the base impact. And I found your article really interesting. And so thank you very much for telling us about it. We're going to take a break, and we're going to talk about some other topics that our guest has been writing about in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Christina Caron with us tonight. She is an economist, and she's had an incredible amount of experience as an independent economist. She's advised 2 Canadian prime ministers and a cabinet minister, and she's written numerous different articles that I found really quite interesting. The most recent one that we've just talked about was food inflation. About a month ago, Christina, you wrote another interesting article that was titled "Environmental Damage is Hurting Both Our Health and Wealth." And you go through statistics on productivity that I thought was about investment, and you're saying it's about climate change. Can you explain what your point is from that article, please?
So yeah, productivity absolutely is partly about investment. That's a really important component. But there's other factors too that we've often been blind to, and those are environmental factors. And the reason economists have been pretty blind to those is because until recently, we didn't really measure them. We didn't incorporate them into our economic frameworks. But when you look at the global economy, productivity growth rates have been declining for decades in advanced economies, and most recently also in emerging economies. And there's been a big debate among economists as to why that was occurring. And there's not really a consensus. And what I have been arguing, based on a lot of evidence, is that when you look at the causes of that global productivity decline, it's largely around environmental factors. So we see climate change, for example, and you see the impact of a wildfire or hurricane when whole towns and area and regions are closed down. People are evacuated. There's no economic activity happening. We take a hit economically when that happens. There's destruction of capital equipment, infrastructure, buildings. Those are all real costs to our economy when that happens. So climate change is taking a large toll. I mean, just in the United States, for example, just in the first 6 months of this year, of 2025, the estimated just physical damage, not including some of the other economic costs that I mentioned, but just the physical damage has been estimated at $100 billion. And 60 billion of that is just the LA wildfires alone. And the thing is these disasters are accelerating. They're coming at us harder and faster.
So
And
the LA fires, I thought were because people were smoking and carelessly let their cigarettes create a forest fire. You're saying it was because of climate change?
effectively, it was because of drought, and we're seeing huge increases in wildfire incidents everywhere, uh, largely because of drought. So the rising temperatures and lack of rainfall conspire together to create a very dry climate where it's very easy for fire to take hold and spread. And we've
So
seen
that the statistic, I apologize for interrupting again, but the statistic that you had in your article was climate change acts as a productivity shock, reducing both output and the supply of productive capital. For example, labor productivity declines by 25% at exposure to temperatures above 25 degrees, by 50% above 33, and by 80% above 35. So I couldn't understand that. What you're saying is that's because it causes drought?
that particular impact is just the impact it has on people. So people do not work very effectively. There's a reason we have something called room temperatures, because that's the temperature that human beings are comfortable working in. And that's why we keep our indoor environments at within a very small temperature range, really, typically. Above that temperature range, people's effectiveness sort of starts to decline. And so the impacts
Do we
of
all want a siesta?
Well, you know what? The impacts are primarily among people who are working outdoors, of course. So, construction workers, people who work on farms. Indoors, we're able to control our environments, but there's been a very noticeable impact on the productivity of workers who are working outdoors. And in parts of the world where it's very hot, people have actually completely shifted their work schedule to start work at 3 a.m. before it gets too warm, and then they stop by midday. And this all has an impact on their productivity.
So you're saying that because of warmer temperatures, because of climate change, we're less productive. And you're also saying that because of warmer temperatures, because of climate change, we get drought. And those droughts, what make us more susceptible to wildfires. And those wildfires cause incredible amount of damage, and that damages GDP growth and productivity.
Absolutely, and as I mentioned before as well, hurricanes have huge impacts, and it's interesting because people who've looked at the impacts of hurricanes find that, for example, in a region which is hit by hurricane, Puerto Rico is a really good example. A few years ago, Puerto Rico was just decimated by a hurricane. And lost 20% of its GDP per capita, basically overnight. And these impacts can persist for 20 years, and local economies don't recover for that time period. There's also very interesting research coming out of Stanford University, for example, which shows that if you look within countries, if you look, for example, in India, the fastest warming areas compared to the slowest warming areas, in other words, those areas that are most affected by climate change, there is a widening gap in terms of economic growth. So the research is becoming very clear that climate change is having a huge economic impact. The latest number that I saw is that to date, it's reduced GDP, world GDP, by a figure of about $50 trillion. So just by way of comparison, that's about half of our total global GDP.
Sorry, repeat that, please. Half of our total GDP is negatively impacted by climate change?
No, so cumulatively, the impact of climate change to date has been we've lost $50 trillion worth of GDP. And on a percentage basis, the estimates are that GDP per capita today, global GDP per capita, is about 15% lower than it would have been in the absence of climate change. And that's
15%,
just climate change.
15.
15%
Sorry, I
lower.
misunderstood. I heard 50%, 15. Okay. So that's unbelievable. You had another statistic in your article that said that pollution is causing premature deaths, and those premature deaths cost $2.2 trillion a year, or 2.5% of global GDP. So that seemed astounding to me. But now you're saying that climate change cumulatively is 15% of GDP. So what, if we had solved climate change 50 years ago or didn't have climate change, we'd all be 15% richer?
Absolutely. That's the implication. Yeah. And pollution. So pollution is another big environmental issue, which causes which has a huge impact. Um, so about 1 out of every 8 deaths worldwide is from air pollution, and which is a lot higher now than it was even 30 years ago. It's actually been declining a little bit, largely driven by declines from in China. But air pollution has a huge impact on early mortality, on disability, and as well, it reduces productivity. So people who are, and wildfire smoke is actually a really good example, and that's the Canadian example. We had Canadian air had been improving for several decades, and all of a sudden, the huge wildfires that we had a couple of years ago, raised the incidence of poor air quality from about 5% to 50% in Canada. And that was just from wildfire smoke. And we know that when there's been high instances of wildfire smoke, a lot of outdoor activities are canceled. Sporting activities are canceled. Restaurants don't open their patios. There's a huge impact on the economy. So that's something where we thought we were doing well, because we had taken a lot of measures to reduce air pollution. But unfortunately, the increasing wildfire incidents has reversed some of that progress.
Did you say that 1 in 8 deaths are caused by air pollution?
Worldwide, absolutely. Now, the number would be lower in North America and Europe, because air pollution is not as bad. Air pollution is worst in parts of Asia and Africa and parts of Eastern Europe. But as I say, it is trending upwards now with wildfire incidents.
Christina, how did you get interested in this topic? What was the motivating factor?
I've been interested in environmental issues for a long time. And I've also been interested in the debate that I mentioned earlier on as to why global productivity growth had been declining for so long. And the specific thing that actually sparked it for me, I'm going to get a little bit nerdy here, but I mentioned that economists have not really measured the impact of the environment on the economy. That's actually changing somewhat now. And we've got measures of what we call natural capital that are just being developed. Natural capital, all that is really, it's an attempt to measure the economic services that are provided to us by natural resources, ecosystems, the environment writ large. And what the United Nations Economic Program has found is that natural capital has been declining. It's declined by 50% over the last 30 years. And natural capital is like any other kind of productive capital. It's like your physical capital, your human capital. If your productive capital is declining, your productivity cannot grow. Like we grow our productivity, we always think of growing our productivity in terms of investing in physical capital, investing in machines or infrastructure. But we have the global economy, and our domestic economy is hugely dependent on the natural environment around us. And the food system is probably the single sector which is most dependent on the natural environment. It depends on a stable climate, it depends on precipitation, arable soil. So it's kind of a canary in the coal mine in terms of price increases and productivity declines. But every sector has dependency on the natural environment as well. And economists are realizing this, and they're realizing that environmental damage is not just a marginal issue. And this is increasingly being recognized by very serious economic actors. So central banks are recognizing this, the network of central banks, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. All of these organizations are recognizing the impacts of climate change and environmental damage, and they're taking steps to integrate those into their macroeconomic models.
This is absolutely fascinating. You said you've worked for 2 different prime ministers and a cabinet minister. Give us a sense of when that was and what was your role? Were you advising for carbon tax or for pollution abatement or what?
So that was quite a long time ago. That was the 2 prime ministers that I worked for were Pierre Trudeau, not Justin Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, and subsequently for a brief period, John Turner. And so I was basically fresh out of graduate school at that point, and I went to work in the policy shop of the Prime Minister's office, doing economic and environmental and energy policy issues primarily. So the whole range of economic policy issues were what I worked on there. And subsequently, I worked for Joyce Fairbairn, who was in that was in the 1990s when she was a cabinet minister and leader of government in the Senate. So I worked for Joyce Fairbairn, providing advice on again the whole range of social and economic policy issues and
What a
briefing her.
fascinating background that you've got. And you were educated at McGill University in what, economics or in climate change or
And
both?
I studied economics at McGill. Yeah, I was
But
at
you've
McGill
really,
for yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was at McGill for my bachelor's degree and also for my master's level studies as well.
And you've really switched from being just a general economist to focusing on climate change.
Actually, much of my career was spent focusing on labor market issues. So I was actually the labor attaché at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. And then subsequently, I was at the Economic Council of Canada, where we did a number of labor market studies, including good jobs, bad jobs, that looked at really kind of broad labor market developments affecting the Canadian labor force.
Okay, so what was it then that motivated you to go from being an advisor to prime ministers and cabinet ministers to focusing on labor market issues to focusing so thoroughly on climate change and the negative impact of climate change on productivity and GDP, et cetera?
I mean, I guess very simply put, first of all, I think the impacts are huge and they're not very well recognized. And it's an area that economists, it's really been a blind spot for economists. For the longest period of time, economists have not really fully assessed what the economic impacts of these environmental developments is. And it's a message I thought needed to get out. And in particular, the impact on productivity. I don't think it's widely recognized. Increasingly it is. And certainly by some leading edge institutions, it's being recognized. But I think more broadly, there's not a lot of understanding out there that environmental damage is taking a real toll on our economic prosperity. It's hitting us in the pocketbook very hard.
I agree. And I think this is a fantastic conversation. So I really appreciate you joining us and I really appreciate the articles that you've written. You wrote a really interesting one that you've touched on about the erosion of natural capital and declining productivity growth. I want to take a break for some messages and come back and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about that. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with Christina Caron, an independent economist, former public servant who's really written about the economic aspects, the economic impacts of climate change. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having a really interesting conversation with Christina Caron today, who is an independent economist and a former federal public servant, an individual who's really focused on the economic impacts of climate change, pollution, etc. She started out just being a general economist and then focused on labor market issues and now has become increasingly focused on the impact of climate change. And I found your article that I guess you wrote for the C.D. Howe Institute, The Erosion of Natural Capital and Declining Productivity Growth, really interesting because I think a lot of us, you know, whether it be just in Finance 101 or Economics 101 or you know, just generally in life, realize, you know, there are numerous different resources that have often been called capital that go into figuring out the value of a firm, the value of an economy, the value of a country, etc. And people have focused on natural resources. They've focused on physical capital. They've focused on human capital. Some people have talked about social capital as being a driver of economic growth, of productivity, etc. And you're saying that I frankly have never heard about before, that natural capital is another form of capital that we need to be thinking about when thinking about the stock of resources that an economy has, and that you're saying that we've been destroying or degrading our natural capital. And I think a lot of us think that you know, the natural capital is a physical beauty. It's beautiful Rocky Mountains and gorgeous lakes and rivers, and we didn't want to pollute it. But you're saying it has a huge economic and productivity impact. or negative economic and negative productivity impact. Take a step back, if you could, and explain that to us all.
Okay, so natural capital is actually a relatively recent term. I think it was first used maybe about 30 years ago. And it, and we've only had attempts to actually measure natural capital in the last 10 to 15 years. And there's only two organizations that are doing that. There's the World Bank, and then there's the one that I mentioned previously, which is the United Nations Environmental Program. And economists have truly had a blind spot with respect to natural capital, in part because we didn't have a term for it and we didn't measure it. And as we all know, what we don't measure, we tend to devalue. So one of the reasons why have been destroying our natural environment, there's several reasons. First of all, for a very long period of time, people thought that the natural environment was so huge, it was infinite, and there was very little that we could do to damage it. But from an economist's point of view, economists, when they look at factors of production, that they didn't include the natural environment, although apparently about 55% of our economy is either moderately or very heavily dependent on the natural environment. But it was not measured, and consequently it was really devalued. And one of the reasons that we have eroded our natural environment is because we didn't measure the types of impacts. We now know that that this kind of degradation is having a huge effect on our economy.
So, the Green Party has certainly talked a lot about climate change, and certainly in some environmental oriented people, there's a cabinet minister in the Trudeau government, still now in the Carney government, that was thought of as an incredible environmentalist. But a lot of people thought that they were negatively impacting the economy, that as we became more environmentally conscious and imposed carbon taxes and regulation and restrictions, that we were negatively impacting the economy. And so that therefore this was harming people in the pocketbook, harming people in the income that they could enjoy. And that it was this trade-off that people thought between protecting the beauty of the environment and the cleanliness of the environment and climate change, if one believed in climate change, versus wealth. You're saying it's not a trade-off, that actually that pollution and not stopping climate change has negatively impacted our wealth. How come there's this disconnect?
Again, I think it's largely because we've been blind to it. We haven't measured the impacts until quite recently. And the studies that are coming out now, for example, on climate change, show that it's much cheaper to address climate change than to deal with the consequences, which are huge already, but they're rising, and they're going to rise even more over time. And biodiversity loss as well is another area. I mean, the productivity of fisheries has declined by about 60% over 40 years. And that's according to a World Bank study. And that's effectively because we're fishing all the fish out of the oceans. And we have to feed ourselves. So if we constantly damage the environment around us, we're by proxy, we're effectively damaging our ability to sustain ourselves.
So one of the examples a lot of people refer to in Ontario is that we've improved, and I think you mentioned this, our air fairly dramatically by getting rid of coal-fired plants and becoming more reliant on nuclear power. Some people don't like the nuclear power because they worry about the nuclear waste. But do you think that improved our productivity because we have less deaths from pollution?
Absolutely. It's been shown that if you have fewer, deaths from pollution, there's the human cost, but also for every individual who's in the workforce, we invest in that individual. We invest in terms of education, healthcare. When that individual has to retire early because of illness or disability, or heaven forbid dies, that's an individual who we've educated and cared for and nurtured to become a productive adult who's taken out of the workforce. So it has very direct impacts on productivity.
So one of the complaints about carbon taxes and dealing with climate change and things like that is that we can't do it alone, that we need the whole world to work on it because if we do something, positive to address climate change here, but China is continuing to build coal-fired plants. It has no impact, and so therefore it's something that it's not worth working on until and unless the whole world works on it. What do you think of that?
Um, I, Certainly, it is something the whole world does have to work on, but we're a very rich economy. I mean, I think the richest economies have the greatest obligation. We've burned huge quantities of fossil fuel. We are very rich. We have the capacity to do this. So I think there's a heavy obligation on the mature and developed economies to take the lead on this. China is actually, yes, they are continuing to build coal-fired plants, but they're also moving very quickly to they're building up their renewable energy capacity. They've electrified a lot of their automobile fleet. So they're taking a lot of positive steps as well. And some of the projections I've seen show that China's coal fired burning is actually about to peak and start to decline.
So, let me ask you about some specific policies that we're currently considering in Canada. We're thinking about another pipeline to the West Coast to take either bitumen or natural gas and then liquefy it. And some people think that that's terrible to the economy. Other people think it's great for the economy because we'll ship more petrochemicals out of Alberta. We've been thinking about critical minerals exploitation, whether it be in the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario or in the Arctic. And some people think that's great because critical minerals are so critically important. Other people think that, I don't know, it's called bogs or peat, and they're very, huge amounts of stores of carbon. And if we start building highways and infrastructure and mines in the peat, in the Ring of Fire and or in the Arctic, we're going to release a huge amount of carbon. So, and other people have commented about uranium, that we should be thinking about building these small nuclear reactors, and that's positive. What do you think about some of these issues that we're addressing right now in the federal government?
So, in terms of fossil fuels, all the projections show that fossil fuel usage is likely to peak, at least those by independent organizations, certainly within the next decade, and then trend downwards. Pipelines do take a long time to build, so it's questionable how much actual use we would get out of that. Canada has very expensive fossil fuels. Oil sands are a very expensive way to extract energy. The other thing I would say is that market forces are really acting in favor of renewable energy sources right now. So in terms of electricity, renewables are by far the cheapest source of electricity. And renewables actually account for the vast majority of new investments because markets recognize that. So about 90% of new investments in electrical generation are now in renewables globally. And that's just because it's the cheapest. So we are moving towards.
But people keep on saying, the solar powers don't work when the sun's not shining, and the wind turbines don't work when the wind's not blowing. So most people think that renewables are, just a nice to do rather than something that you can actually have supplying base energy load.
Yeah, so effectively, there are time limitations, but we've also had huge improvements in battery storage over the last few years, and those improvements are continuing and able to address some of the intermittency of some of these sources. Plus, you have complementary sources as well. So if you have both wind and solar, then presumably the wind is blowing some of the time when the sun's not shining as well. So there's ways to address this, and the technology is just growing by leaps and bounds as well.
But Christina, it seems like the world is going the opposite direction to what you're talking about. GM just last week announced they're closing down a electric van production in Ingersoll because there's no demand for these electric delivery vans, or maybe it's Trump tariffs or something like that. We invested a huge amount of money in battery plants across southern Ontario to try to move toward electric cars, and electric car consumption, electric car purchases are down dramatically. It would appear that this whole flavor, this whole attitude back in the 20 teens toward being worried about climate change, addressing climate change, moving toward alternative energy, moving toward some of the renewables that you're talking about, thinking about electric cars, thinking about electric batteries, has gone away, and we're all just back into driving these big, huge gas guzzling trucks.
So again, when you look globally, you actually see that North America is to some degree an outlier, and it's largely driven by political development south of the border as well. Trump has signaled very, very clearly that he's opposed to renewables, opposed to electrification. But when you look more broadly, you do see that there's been actually huge growth in electric vehicles in China, in Europe, in Norway is almost entirely electric vehicles at this point. China has.
Norway is a hydrocarbon superstar. They created a huge amount of wealth from hydrocarbons. Why would they be going electric?
They see where the future is going, and the future is electric. And so, certainly growth in North America has slowed in terms of electric vehicles, but I would see that as a more temporary setback. I think absolutely that we can see where the markets are going. They're going to electric vehicles. Electricity is a much more efficient energy source as well. When you burn fossil fuels, it's not terribly efficient. There's a lot of energy lost in transportation, but also just in the consumption. Electricity is a very efficient energy source. So actually, when you switch from fossil fuels to electricity, you need less energy because it's a more efficient power source.
This is an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I think it is the opposite from what a lot of people are currently thinking. It's certainly what sort of the national political mood is all about. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with our guest, Christina Caron, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having a really fascinating, I think, a critically important conversation with Christina Caron today. She's written numerous different articles that I've read in the Globe and Mail that you've probably read as well, and with the C.D. Howe Institute, etc., about climate change, but about how it's negatively impacting our productivity, our GDP, our income, our national wealth. And she's sort of put forward this point of view that I've never heard before that's really kind of interesting, that we got to think about it as our physical capital. We've all thought about natural resources as natural as physical capital. We've always talked about banks and money as financial capital. Some people have talked about human capital being your most important resource, and some people agree with that and some people don't agree with that. And I've heard recently a lot of conversations about social capital, but Christina's talked about natural capital. And that as we degrade our environment, it negatively impacts us. It's fascinating. Christina, if our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, invited you to come and sit down and chat with him for an hour or so about this issue, about consumer carbon taxes, industrial carbon taxes, pollution, our environment, these national projects that he's considering with pipelines and stuff like that, what would you tell him? What would you tell him should be his priorities, given your research and your writing?
So first of all, I have to say that I absolutely do not envy his position, because we're facing a huge number of pressures right now, most notably, of course, Trump's trade war. And that's an enormous pressure. We have other fiscal pressures. We have fiscal pressures related to supporting workers who are displaced by the trade war. And we have pressures on defense spending. So it's not an easy time to be prime minister. And there's many actually conflicting priorities. But what I would say is we can't take our eye off the climate ball and the natural environment ball, because those pressures are going to remain with us. They're not going away. And fundamentally, they could actually have, over the longer term, a greater impact on our economy than some of these other pressures. So effectively, I would say, yes, we have to act on the immediate pressures, but we have to focus as well on some of the longer term and medium term issues. Some of them are not even that longer term. We're already being hit by wildfires and drought. So we have to take action on climate, whether it's by regulation. There's many different ways that you can address climate issues, but we have to take action. We also have to take action to preserve our biodiversity. Canada's extraordinarily lucky. We have one of the most biodiverse environments in the world, and we have committed to set aside 30% of that environment as protected under the Montreal Biodiversity Framework. So I would simply urge that those be considered as part of our whole policy package in terms of priorities.
There's a lot of pressure for him to not only have gotten rid of the consumer carbon tax, which he did, but also the industrial carbon tax. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think personally that the industrial carbon tax is a very effective measure. It would be a shame to get rid of it because it has an impact on consumption. And Canada has not done a very good job of getting our emissions down. We're actually one of the weakest of the G7 countries in terms of that, and that certainly needs to change. So we need to have effective measures to reduce our emissions. And in particular, if we are going to continue developing our oil sands, which seems to be the case because about a third of our national emissions are coming from the oil sands right now. And that's actually the single factor which is keeping our emissions up because other sectors have been declining.
Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, is almost holding the country up for ransom by saying if you don't build more pipelines, Alberta is going to leave Canada, and it's a pipeline to the West Coast as well as potentially another pipeline to the United States, reopening Keystone Pipeline. Should we be building more pipelines or not?
I personally don't think we should. I think the future is electric. I don't think that there's a sustainable market for our oil. We already have one pipeline to the West Coast, which is not being fully utilized. Another pipeline to the US would be superfluous at this stage.
Critical minerals. China, I understand, controls something like 60 to 70% of the mining of critical minerals and 90% of the processing of critical minerals. Canada is one of the sources in the Ring of Fire and/or in the Arctic of critical minerals, but there are indigenous land claims issues, and there's climate change issues in regards to peat, bogs, etc. What should we be doing with with critical minerals? Should we be exploiting them or no, keeping them in the ground?
I think that electrification will certainly require a number of critical minerals. But we need to proceed carefully and with appropriate consultations. But certainly in terms of environmental impacts, we know that the impact of mining and transporting fossil fuels has a lot more impact on the environment than critical minerals does. I mean, just to give you one example, about half of the tanker traffic on the oceans is just consumed by transporting fossil fuels. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the fossil fuel impact on our economy. Critical minerals certainly do have an impact, but relatively speaking, it's less pronounced.
We put in 100% tariffs on electric cars from China because we wanted to keep a domestic car industry. And some people have said that was great for jobs in southwestern Ontario, but it was terrible for the environment because by switching to cheaper electric cars, we would have helped the environment. What's the right strategy in regards to tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles?
That's a very delicate balance. And frankly, there's so many moving parts as well with the tariff war. I don't think I could pronounce on that without knowledge of what is happening with the tariffs. Certainly you could improve the adoption of electric vehicles by getting rid of the tariff on Chinese vehicles. But we have to balance that against our own domestic workers as well. And that's something I'm going to leave to the Prime Minister.
Last question. Should we be building more nuclear power plants?
What we see is that renewables are actually a more effective way of generating electricity over the longer term than nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants are very expensive. They take a very long time to build, so they're not terribly efficient as a way to improve capacity in the short term. And they do leave us with very long-term problems like management of nuclear waste, for sometimes for thousands or tens of thousands of years. So, as a strategy for electrification, no, I would say that renewables are the way to go. And we certainly need to strengthen our electrical grid as well, so we have better transmission between provinces.
Christina Caron, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much. I think that the learning that I've got from this conversation more than anything else is the idea of natural capital. And, I've thought about financial capital, about physical capital, about human capital, about social capital before. I've never thought about the importance of natural capital. And it makes a ton of sense. And I really appreciate you adding a far more economically oriented point of view to the issues of climate change and pollution. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on social media, on my YouTube channel, on LinkedIn, and on podcast servers as soon as the radio show gets broadcast to air. Thanks for joining us, everybody. What an interesting conversation. We've got to start thinking about natural capital. Good night, everybody.